Okay. How does getting started sound? All right. Can everybody hear me? Is anybody having trouble connecting? Just gonna assume that you can. All right. Well, thanks for being here tonight, everybody. Um, I want to welcome Dr. Lindsay to our program this evening. She is joining us to talk about documenting defining moments and talk a little bit, go into depth a little bit on the experiences she's had writing, drafting National Historic Landmark nominations. Um, but before we get to that, I do want to say a few logistical things. First, we are recording the session tonight, so if everything goes well, then you can rewatch it later on our YouTube channel. And second, do please put any questions that come up during the presentation in the chat. We've reserved a little bit of time at the end for discussion or just general chatter if there are no direct questions. And as you can see up on our landing slide, which we'll take down in a minute, we do have a few more pretty major events coming up. So be sure and check out the events page on our website. We have another virtual talk coming up in April about the Sunset Magazine Garden in Menlo Park, which is already seeing a lot of interest because it's facing demolition. So that should be a very interesting talk. And then an in-person tour in June on Saturday to go visit the Donnell Garden and the pool up there. So that will be an all-day event and a mini fundraiser for our organization. So be sure and check those things out. I know of a couple other events that will go up on our events page soon. I believe we're doing an in-person tour in the Los Angeles area, also in June. We'll be unveiling two major projects shortly. We'll be unveiling the announcement for our first formal publication as an organization entitled California Eden, which combines some really exciting photography and essays from our quarterly journal, and it's coming out this year. It's been in the works for a long time, however. And then hopefully very soon we will be announcing the location for our annual conference. And all I can say about that right now is that it will be in Southern California and it will be in October. But I'll wait for the big reveal before I say more. So with that being said, oh, there in the chat, Libby Simon, June 2nd, Faux Bois tour of, I always say the name of this town wrong, so I won't even try, but it's in Los Angeles County. And that should be really interesting. I think that involves a couple of other stops at National Register listed properties. All right, so thank you everybody for being here. And Anne, I thought maybe we could just start with a bit more of an informal introduction for you rather than just sort of reading your bio. I thought maybe we could you could talk a little bit about how you got connected with CGLHS, and then I have a few other just kind of topics I'd like to summarize before we dive into your presentation.
Absolutely. I got connected with CGLHS through Janet. I was at a celebration of a documentary made about Pond Farm Pottery, which is a site that I co-authored the National Historic Landmark for. And then in talking, Janet encouraged me to give a talk. And so I'm very happy to be here. And thank you so much for inviting me.
Great. So you live here in California. You live in Elk Grove.
I do.
Okay, and you've authored at least two National Historic Landmark nominations for properties here in California. Is that correct?
I've done one in California, one in Florida, and I'm working on a second one in California now. So Pond Farm Pottery is in Guerneville, California. I also have a National Historic Landmark at Norman Film Manufacturing Company, which is in Jacksonville, Florida. And then I am deep into the revision of Sutter's Fort National Historic Landmark for the National Park Service and for state parks. And that's a really interesting process as well. And I will talk about all of those in the course of my presentation tonight.
Excellent. So you have pretty deep California experience. Have you done a lot of National Register nominations as well?
That's a great question.
Okay.
So my graduate degrees are from UC Riverside. So I'm actually a native Floridian. But I went to school in Southern California and then got a job in Northern California. So I'm a consulting historian at the moment, but I used to be a professor at Sacramento State. So through that through the National Park Service, I was engaged in a program to teach the next generation how to write National Historic Landmarks, and that's how I got started. But I have not written a lot of National Register nominations myself. I've actually written more National Historic Landmarks. What I've done a lot of is supervise students who are writing National Register nominations, and help them get through the process and think about how to craft arguments and things like that. So my designation experience is mostly National Historic Landmarks, actually.
That's such a niche. I've written so many National Register nominations, or at least determinations of eligibility, but I've never had the opportunity to write an NHL. I've worked on sites that have them, and it seems to trigger all sorts of additional review and kind of complexity in my project. So I'm really curious about, how those decisions are made, like what constitutes National Historic Landmark. All right, and so is your background in historic preservation? This is sort of my final question for you.
Yes, my background is my degrees are in public history with an emphasis in historic preservation, and heritage tourism. And I also do work on colonial America. And so I kind of bring all those together, because I write in my sort of academia life about 18th century interpretation. So interpretation at 18th century sites, including the interpretation of historic garden spaces and the Atlantic contexts and things of that nature. And I'm also currently working with a group called Revolutionary Narratives, which is working on creating more inclusive and expansive interpretations for the semi-quincentennial that's coming up. So I'm doing 250 things, but also historic preservation things.
That's a very interesting career path. For somebody who has similar training to me, it's interesting how these things can be so divergent, similar training, similar interests, but very different niches. That's cool. All right, well, thanks so much for walking us through that. And I think I'll just go ahead and hand off the presentation to you, which, Janet, I believe that means you can stop sharing. And then we'll ensure that Anne is able to share her presentation. And then I'll cut it off. We'll monitor the chat, everybody, and I'll cut you off very politely and smoothly with around 15 minutes left in the hour, so that we can have some time reserved for discussion.
Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you so much. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone. Again, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm going to be talking about the National Historic Landmark Program. And I titled this talk Documenting Defining Moments, because that's really what the National Historic Landmark Program is about. It's about documenting those seminal moments in American history that have meaning for large parts of the population. So my plan is to give us a sense of the difference between National Register and National Historic Landmark, walk you through how a document is initiated, look at how the National Historic Landmark process works, and then show you how the document itself is outlined. And then throughout, I'll have some images, and I'll be able to talk a little bit about my own experience as we go through here. I've worked with the National Park Service for over a decade on National Historic Landmark nominations. I was part of a program to train professors to teach this in their classroom. I was one of only 3 who did this. And I continue to have that relationship with the National Park Service, which is really nice because they're very helpful. And I've worked with the Washington office, and now I work at the San Francisco regional office. All of the information that I'm sharing tonight, you can always get more information from the website for the National Historic Landmark Program. They have preparation guides, and also a lot of samples that you can look at. So let's start with, what is a National Historic Landmark? A National Historic Landmark is a location in the US or in the territories that is the best place to tell the story of a particular moment in American history. And this is one of the biggest ways that it is different from a National Register nomination. The places that are National Historic Landmarks are really where we can tell the best story, and we're going to have to make that argument throughout our document that this is the place in the United States to learn about this person or this architectural style or this event, things of that nature. The National Historic Landmark is the highest level of federal designation. There are currently 2,600 of them in the United States. The largest owner of NHLs is the federal government. The second largest holder of NHLs in the United States is California State Parks. Compared to NHLs, there are approximately 93,350 National Register listings. And that number continues to go up. And if you think about it, that's just listings. If you think about the number of properties, structures, objects within some of those listings, the number of elements of our built landscape are on the National Register is really high. And NHL, in addition, often exemplifies broader patterns of history. So while it might be important to understanding a particular moment, it can also help us to understand larger themes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Many National Historic Landmarks are associated with the National Park Service theme studies. If you're not familiar with the theme studies, you can find them on the National Park Service website. The theme studies are intensive contexts of themes in American history. So for example, there's a really great civil rights theme study right now that encompasses 6 different documents that talk about everything from education to housing covenants to labor, and really gives us some of the context and also helps us to identify the types of properties that we might designate under that theme. And so it's very helpful. Any resource can be both a National Register and a National Historic Landmark. They don't have to be exclusively one or the other, but not every National Register nomination will be eligible to be a National Historic Landmark. It really is a more exclusive designation. National Historic Landmarks can be, just like National Registers, kind of anything: archaeological sites, landscapes, objects, structures, buildings, districts, even ideas. There is a process to update National Historic Landmarks. Some National Historic Landmarks have changed since their initial designation. If you've looked at old National Registers, the ones that are done sort of mid to late 60s or the ones done in the early 70s, you might have noticed that they're really thin. There's not a lot of documentation. The discussion of the context is like a paragraph or less. Definitely a different kind of writing than we use today when we're writing National Register nominations. National Historic Landmarks, same thing. Very thin documentation, particularly on the early ones. So the National Park Service does allow National Historic Landmarks to be updated if you can prove that the documentation that you would add would provide an important element to understanding the site. And if you think about it, history and historiography changes over time, and that does impact our understanding of these resources. Just to give you an example, Sutter's Fort that I'm working on right now is an NHL update. The original documentation for Sutter's Fort was done, it was one of the earliest ones, actually. There was a cluster of sites in the West that included Donner Pass, I think, and Fort Ross, and Sutter's Fort was in with them. And there was a sort of idea that like these should just be National Historic Landmarks. And so their documentation is pretty thin. It talks a lot, the original NHL talks a lot about John Sutter, and that's about it. As we look at Sutter's Fort, we're not going to change the boundaries in the update, but the way that we think about John Sutter has changed over time. We know more about him than we did before, and we don't necessarily hold him up as a hero the way that he was at this time. This is around the 1976 celebrations. There's a lot of pioneer heritage celebrations as well. And so Sutter was really thought to be a leader. And now we think about Sutter differently as an exploiter, as an enslaver, as a trafficker. And so when we look at Sutter's Fort, we really have to think, is it important because Sutter was there, or is it important on its own right? And so the update is going to be more about how Sutter's Fort is an indigenous space, was always an indigenous space, and continued to be so during Sutter's time. But we're also talking about new Western history. The way that we talk about the history of the West has definitely changed since the 70s. And we're talking about Sutter's Fort as a borderlands, a place where multiple empires are coming together at once. We're also talking about it as a place where the national boundaries are being extended. And of course, it's the terminus of the trail into California. So many overlanders came through Sutter's Fort. It's a much richer story that's been told before. The other thing you can do in an update, which we'll be doing with Sutter's Fort, is you can add another period of significance, which is what we're doing. So we have an initial period of significance for the period, the Sutter period, but we have another period of significance that's for the initiation of the historic preservation movement. Sutter's Fort was a reconstruction. It was done as a preservation method. It was part of a trend of preservation done by pioneer heritage organizations in the late 19th century. It's the first of them. And it really initiates the preservation movement in the West. Well, that's a very important context for Sutter's Fort, not something that we would have talked about in that early designation, but that work is over 50 years old, and it's very important now. So as we think about updates, if you have a site that you think, wow, this isn't covered, it really should be, that might be a trigger for writing an update. Now, the update process is basically exactly the same as the NHL process. So it's not necessarily a shortcut. I can tell you Sutter's Fort's been going for 4 years now, so it's pretty much the same. So I wanted to throw up sort of an analysis or for you so you can see kind of what is the same and what is different between these federal designation programs. And again, these are not the only federal documentation programs. These are the federal designation programs. The National Register requires owner consent. So does the National Historic Landmark. That's a deal breaker. Got to have it. The National Register, the exterior integrity is really scrutinized, but the bar of integrity is lower than for the National Historic Landmark. For a National Historic Landmark, exterior and interior integrity are considered, and there's a higher threshold for integrity. It's going to use the same measures of integrity that the National Register does, the same metrics, but the threshold for each will be higher. The National Register considers local, state, or national significance. National Historic Landmark, again, national only. National Register, sometimes our period of significance is a little bit longer, can encompass a little bit more. The period of significance for a National Historic Landmark must be justified and is very precise. It could be a couple of days. It could be hours. It could be a week, or it could be a couple of years. So it's going to be very strictly defined. National registers require intensive research. National Historic Landmarks do too. That research will be peer reviewed. And the National Register does not require peer review. And then the process for a National Register. You're going to submit to the Office of Historic Preservation. It's going to be reviewed by the State Historic Resources Commission, forwarded by the SHPO to the keeper of the register. The National Historic Landmark Program is very different. We'll submit to the National Park Service. It'll be reviewed by the NHL Committee, forwarded to the National Park Service Advisory Board, who will then forward it to the Secretary of the Interior. So it takes longer. Those are federal committees, and it takes time for them to move through this process. The NHL Committee only meets twice a year. It's not a monthly situation, and that is an appointed committee. And so sometimes there is some lag between administrations as well, because it's all political appointment. The NHL Committee that's reviewing these documents is composed of historians, architects, archaeologists, and other specialists in historic preservation. I'm going to take you through the criteria for National Historic Landmarks. You'll see they're a little bit different from the National Register, but not vastly, and also give you some examples of those properties. First one is properties associated with events. These are events that have made a contribution in United States history. One example that's used a lot for criteria 1 is the Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, is a National Historic Landmark. The one I have on the screen here is the silent film studio in Jacksonville, Florida, that I designated with my students. This was my first National Historic Landmark. Is designated in 2016. Norman Film Manufacturing Company is the last silent film studio in the United States, which means that it is the essential place to learn about silent film. And you may be saying to yourself, well, shouldn't that be in Southern California? Like, if we're gonna have a National Historic Landmark associated with silent films, shouldn't it be there? I agree. However, there are no extant silent film studios in Southern California, which we discovered through our comparative analysis process, which I will also talk about. Sometimes the first or the last of a thing finds its way onto the National Historic Landmark list. It doesn't have to be that way. It just happened to work that way for this one. And many of the things that you'll see tonight in the pictures, they look a little unassuming. Some of them are very impressive. And some of them, I mean, this building, it doesn't look that impressive, right, from the street. But this, before film moved to Hollywood, the film industry used Jacksonville in the winter because of the more temperate climate and because it was connected by rail to New York. So the film producers in New York and Chicago would come to Jacksonville to make films in the wintertime. Norman Film Manufacturing Company still has all of its original buildings. It has its water tower, its set design building, it has its costume building. All of that is still there, plus the mechanisms, which I'll show you in a little bit. It still has its film vault and its screening room. So this is a very interesting resource. Its integrity is not as high as we would usually have on the National Historic Landmark Program, but the rarity of the resource is what's going to make it more eligible. And we will talk a little bit about integrity and how that's considered for the National Historic Landmark Program in a bit. Criteria 2 are properties that are associated with important people in the history of the United States. That's where Pond Farm Pottery in Guerneville, California comes in. Now, Pond Farm Pottery is eligible under Criterion 1 and Criterion 2. Just like the National Register, you only have to have one, but we do the ones that, of course, fit, right? So Pond Farm Pottery is eligible under Criterion 1 because of its contribution to the American studio pottery movement, and Criterion 2 because of its association with the ceramicist Marguerite Wildenhain. So this was designated in 2023, and I'll be using some other images from it later. But that's, if you have more than one criterion, of course, you've given yourself double the work. But that, and it can be very hard when you have two criterion to separate one from another. How do you talk about a ceramicist outside of the American studio pottery movement? How do you separate those two things? There's a lot of crossover. So it's a very carefully written document. One thing that you'll find as we're going tonight is National Historic Landmarks have their own logic, the thought process that goes into them. And it's really practice to get you through it in a particular way. And National Park Service can help you with that. But the thought process of it is a little bit different than a National Register. Criterion 3 is properties that represent some great idea or ideal of the American people. I find this a very interesting criterion, and the example that I have for it is the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which is a division of the New York Public Library. It was designated in 2017. It was less than 50 years old. The 50-year rule matters to us here, but there are, of course, exceptions. The Schomburg Center was established by people that were important in the study of Black culture, but also the Schomburg Center is the essential place to understand the African diaspora in the United States. And that is the foundation for its designation under Criterion 3. Criterion 4 is the architecture criterion. These are, of course, properties that are the characteristics of an architectural type or a specimen. I believe that landscape architecture would fit here too. Method of construction, significant and distinctive elements, and particularly in Criterion 4, the interior and the exterior need to exhibit exceptional integrity, as you might imagine. This is Samara, which is in West Lafayette, Indiana. This is the most complete Frank Lloyd Wright structure in the country. It has both a very high integrity on the exterior, and then the interior is as Wright designed as well. So you can see a little bit of that here in this kind of sunken living room situation. The colors, the patterns, the fenestration, all of that designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. So this is a very interesting property. Criterion 5 is the one for historic districts. You can have National Historic Landmark districts. And like a National Register district, the individual properties might not qualify, but they do as a grouping. My example here actually is a very interesting one. This is Chicano Park in San Diego. This is on the National Historic Landmark list. As you can see, this is in large part a series of murals. So if you look at the underpasses here, you've got, if you can look kind of successively back, I was trying to find a better picture here, but it was a little challenging. There are a series of Chicano murals throughout. And then you also have a great series of other kind of parks and structures associated with it. And criteria 6 is archaeology. And that is not something that is archaeologically significant. It is something that will be significant in the future. So it is anticipating a future of research value in a site. There are, of course, exceptions, just like there are in the National Register. Religious structures, properties that have had significance within the last 50 years, things of that nature. How do you start the National Historic Landmark process? It starts with a letter of inquiry. You write a letter asking the National Park Service for concurrence in your finding of eligibility. And basically, this is your pitch. You're going to send a letter to the National Park Service where you are evaluating the history of the site, the integrity, which criterion you want to use, who owns it, how it's being used, if there's any threats to the property, which I always say fire, plans for the property moving forward. You can also include some comparable properties to show that this is the place in the United States to understand this history. And that letter of inquiry is usually a couple pages long, and you'll send it to your regional office. So you would send it to the San Francisco office here in California. You'll get a response to the letter of inquiry, and the NPS will give their findings. They'll either say no, or they might concur with your determination. And then the letter of inquiry becomes a really important document because they give you great ideas on where to start. They give you some research materials to begin with, things that they're hoping that you're going to include, and they give you some avenues that they'd like you to explore within the nomination, things that they think are going to be important to making that argument. And they will go back to that letter of inquiry, and you will go back to it too. It's a really great document to start your process. I wanted to give you a sense of all of the pieces of an NHL document because there's a lot of them. You start with historic contexts. Whatever criteria you have, you're going to need to talk about the contexts there. You're going to talk about the history of prior designation, if there is one. So if it's already an NR or a California landmark or something like that, how did that happen? You're going to have a summary statement of significance, criterion and exception justifications. Each criteria has to be justified independently. You'll be justifying the period of significance. And then you'll be writing a detailed historic context discussion. So early on, that first historic context, you are identifying which themes in American history this National Historic Landmark connects to. So for example, Sutter's Fort connects to the expansion of the westward boundaries to the Pacific, just as one of its historic contexts. So in the historic context section, I'm going to have to write about that. This is the primary argumentative area of the document. It involves primary research, secondary research. You may be requested to include historiography if the site's history has been reinterpreted over time. So for example, when we were doing the American studio pottery movement, and we were talking about Pond Farm pottery, we had to talk about the start of the art and craft movement in the United States. We had to talk about how pottery evolved over time, who the big influencers were at that time. We also had to talk about the Bauhaus because the artist was trained at the Bauhaus. And we had to talk about how her art was different and how it made an impact. We definitely had to talk to some art historians. So there's a lot of research here. For Sutter's Fort, we have to include the new Western history and how Sutter has been interpreted over time to make this justification of changing the way that we think about him. So that historic context discussion is very long. And you may be looking at this list and wondering how long these documents are. A short one would be about 50 pages, I would say. Every National Historic Landmark has a comparative analysis where you are showing other sites that might be used to illustrate this history and why the site that you've selected is really the best one to understand this moment in American history. This is required for each criterion. So if you have 3 criterion, you have to do a comparative analysis for each. So this is a very interesting section to write. It can be hard to figure out. National Park Service is willing to help you figure those out. For example, for Norman Film Manufacturing Company, it was a little difficult to find other silent film studios. It turns out one of them was Marineland, which was developed as a silent film studio. And so that showed up in our comparative analysis, and so did a number of others. There are elements of the silent film studios still on the lots of studios like Warner Brothers, but they are not in the same condition that they were. So that comparative analysis section is very interesting. It's not a straw man argument. The comparative analysis section is really about understanding how these sites are in communication with each other and how this individual place is really unique for understanding this story. Of course, detailed property description, including all contributing and non-contributing elements and landscape, discussion of any alterations to the structures and to the landscape, and then integrity discussions based on the elements of integrity. It'll also include site maps, as always, and present and historic images. Just to give you an example, the National Historic Landmark Program loves side-by-side images, just like the National Register does. So this is one for Pond Farm Pottery. On the right, you can see what it looks like today inside that prow-fronted barn. you can see all the different pottery stations. On the left, you can actually see the pottery stations being used by the students. And the artist is there. Margarita's in the picture as well. We're using this picture through the University of Arizona has given us permission for this image because any images that you use, of course, are going to be at the Library of Congress, and then also the presentations will be available. And so there's copyright that needs to be done as you're preparing these. These are images from Norman Film Manufacturing Company. This is a great way to show that the infrastructure is still there. On the right is one of the original engines from the site, and then on the left is the historic image. Norman happened to have promotional pictures taken of the site to try to encourage New York studios to come and use the site. And so there happened to be historic images of interiors, and that was very helpful in showing that those interiors haven't changed. And that's a great way. And same thing at Pond Farm. We had images of the kiln. We had historic images of the kiln. So when you can show those side by sides, it really helps to make the argument for integrity. But let's talk about integrity a little bit. And I think this is true for the National Register as well. But for those sites that are associated with underrepresented communities on the NHL list, integrity can be considered in a bit more of a flexible framework. In the last couple of years, I've been working with the National Park Service to try to identify African-American sites in California that might be eligible for the NHL list. That was the most recent project that I was working on while I was still working at Sacramento State. And the rarity of the resource, as we talked about with Norman Film Manufacturing Company, which was making race films, and its use over time, are going to have an impact on integrity. And so if you think about underrepresented communities, a lot of those structures are being used for multiple things. They're in neighborhoods that are often subject to urban renewal projects. A lot of those buildings have changed over time. So you really have to lean into those integrity elements of feeling and association to help to show that the integrity is intact. I was at a presentation by someone that worked in the National Register program in Washington, and he said, for like LGBTQ clubs, it can be very hard to prove integrity because, a club will change hands so many times in 50 years. And he was like, but, if you go in there and you turn off the lights and it still feels like a club, doesn't it still have the feeling and association? So it's an ongoing conversation as we try to make the NHL list or the NHL integrity requirements more flexible so that we can get more representation from underrepresented communities. And if you're wondering how underrepresented groups are, here in California, there are no National Historic Landmarks associated with African-American history. 0. The process for getting your NHL approved is pretty involved, and so I wanted to give you a sense of what that looks like. You start with that letter of inquiry, which we talked about. You get a response. You go on your way. You write your draft. You send it into NPS. They're going to look at it and give you feedback, let you know what needs to be fixed, what they're looking for, things that they think aren't needed, new ways to think about it. You'll do another draft. When it looks pretty good, if you need to do any kind of consultation, that's when that will happen. That's our next step for Sutter's Fort. We're in the middle of tribal consultation right now with a number of different Indigenous communities to talk about memories of Sutter's Fort and how they feel about the designation. Then you will go to peer review. The peer review process is the same as, say, a peer review for if you wrote an article, for example. It will go to specialists in the field. For Pond Farm Pottery, it went to art historians. Norman Film Manufacturing Company went to historians. And so they're sending it out to people who are at the top of the field so that they can talk about where this fits. And those peer review reports will come back. You'll need to respond and edit based on them. Unlike blind peer review in other kinds of contexts, you can request to know who your peer reviewers are and have a conversation with them. That worked out very well for us in Pond Farm Pottery. We had some very interesting comments from one of our reviewers. We requested that person's name. They concurred. We contacted them and we had a great conversation, and she did an amazing job of trying to help us understand the way to discuss art history as historians and how to understand the relationships at play in the art community. Compiling evidence and materials for the NHL committee will happen once you're really at that point of it's going to go to the federal level. You'll have a notification list. So you'll actually need to fill out an Excel spreadsheet that you will get from National Park Service listing who needs to be notified. And it starts with people like, who is the mayor of the town? Who is the congressman in this district? Who are the senators? And you need to list all of their information, all their contact information, who are the owners, and then other interested parties who should also be notified of this National Historic Landmark, and they will get notification that this is going to be heard. You also need to prepare an executive summary that will go to the NHL committee, and a PowerPoint. You get the PowerPoint structure from the National Park Service. It's really rigid. They tell you exactly how many slides. They give you the template for the slides and tell you what should be in them, and also, what you should include and not include. In some cases, you will present your material to the NHL committee, which is in Washington, but they've been doing their meetings virtually since 2020. And in some cases, the regional office will take over from there and finish it out. So it just depends on which regional office you're working with. After the NHL committee, any edits will be completed from the NHL committee, and then you wait for approval from both the National Park Service Advisory Board and then approval from the Secretary of the Interior. So it's a relatively long process, and it can take several years. Pond Farm Pottery took us 5 years, which was, a little bit exaggerated because COVID happened and that slowed everything down. And just a reminder that the National Park Service Regional Office will provide a lot of support during the process. They can help you with the comparative properties. They provide templates for elements of the designation and the presentation. They often know of good research avenues if you get stuck. I've definitely done that before. And they can point you to other nominations that you can look at for guidance. This is really important because every single National Historic Landmark is unique. That's one of the things that's amazing about this program. One of the things I love about it. Every nomination is going to look a little bit different. Things that were important in one nomination won't be important in another. So you really have to understand the logic of the document and kind of think creatively about how you're going to be making the argument. But a lot of times NPS can say, this section that was written in this nomination would probably work well for what you're doing. Maybe you should look at this newer nomination that was just done for this house, or something that was just done for this landscape. And it's very helpful to look at how other people have written it and to think about how that really impacts your own document. So it's always good to keep open lines of communication with National Park Service while you're working on an NHL, because they really are there to help you out. They want you to be successful. And of course, they have a lot of resources on their website, preparation guides and samples and all of those things. And some of the examples that I've used today come from the National Park Service National Historic Landmark site. Thank you so much for listening to my talk here on National Historic Landmarks. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have at this point.
Thank you. And that was really interesting. I don't think I realized how long it takes to write an NHL. I think that's what I learned the most through your process, is that it takes 4 to 5 years. I mean, I have several questions about that. I want to be sure and let people in the room know that they can either just turn off. I think we have a small enough group that you can just turn off you can unmute yourselves and hop in if you have a question, or if you're more comfortable putting it in the chat, I'm happy to field that and read it out loud. So I'll keep an eye on the chat and also just jump in. But I think my question is, you mentioned that most of the largest landholder of NHLs is MPS. So for those properties, and presumably for state-owned properties, the funding for these very long processes comes down through the federal government or the state government in some way, through grants or other avenues like that. But are there ever private properties or private citizens who elect to go through this process, the NHL process?
Yeah, actually, many NHLs are privately owned.
Okay.
And so the great majority of them actually are privately owned. Some individuals will pay for this themselves. Sometimes they will hire consulting firms. Depending on the resource, there are sometimes grants you can apply for to get assistance with the cost, particularly if you're part of like the Civil Rights Network, or if you're from an underrepresented community. There are sometimes grant programs to get funding to help you with that. Um, the program that I was part of to train students, the purpose of that program was to be able to help sites that couldn't afford it. And so they wouldn't have to pay for the landmark to be written, but they would also get their landmark written by students, which actually they were graduate students. So it was a great opportunity and it was nice work. And it was a great way to create connections with a new generation. So Norman Film Manufacturing Company was one of those sites. It was known to the National Park Service as a site that needed to be designated and that was kind of ready to go, but they had no money. They were showing silent films on the weekend to keep the lights on.
Wow.
And so, you know, us doing it for free allowed them to sort of launch. And now they've really taken off since they've been designated, and they have a museum now, and they have opened to the public, and they've done some restoration work, and that's very exciting. But they never would have been able to access some of those funds or programs without the NHL, and they never could have paid for it. So yeah, it is an expensive proposition.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Go ahead, Chris.
You know, a lot of us here have been working a lot with Historic American Landscape Survey, and it's been frustrating that it has been woefully underfunded. What's it like working with the National Park Service on National Historic designations? Is the staffing there? Is the current administration supporting these programs?
I mean, I can only speak for my individual experience, and it has been very good with the National Historic Landmark Program. They've been very helpful, pretty responsive. And, you know, part of it is I'm working with students, but also when I don't have students, they're really good about, you know, answering questions and supporting and things like that. And part of our program was that they gave workshops to the students. So they would come in like at least once a semester, and actually introduce them to the program and help them think about things. But also if they had questions, and I mean, they're, you know, often in a different time zone, or my class started at 6, that's past the 8 to 5, right? But they're still zoomed into my class to answer questions. I mean, I had a group of students that really had a question about a comment that they made on one of their drafts, and they zoomed in and talked it out with them, which was really great. And they're also really willing to listen to your argument. So if you say, you know what, I know you want me to go this way, the research doesn't bear it out, I don't think it belongs in this, they're willing to listen and be convinced. So, you know, in the National Historic Landmark Program, at least, I've had good experiences with the staffing from NPS.
That's great. Thank you.
I mean, part of Rich, were you ready? Did you have a question? Go ahead. I have a lot of questions, but everybody else should go first.
Great, thanks, Anne. That was a great presentation, and I knew that the criteria were different, but I didn't realize how sort of rigorous and detailed that it was, and sort of compared to National Register nominations. And I'm just curious, when I think about NHLs, I think about sites and districts, but I realized like it could be any type of property type. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of how they break down. Like, are they mostly buildings and structures? Are there a lot of landscapes, districts? I'm just curious if you have a sense of what that looks like nationally or even California.
I don't know that. That's a great question, but I can say that there are a number of nominations that encompass more than one thing. So, you know, the landscape for Pond Farm Pottery, for example, was part of the designation. The landscape at Sutter's Fort is also a required part of the designation, as that's a designed landscape. So it just depends. There are those sites that are designated only as landscapes. There are things that are designated that are just a sign. So it just depends. But I sorry, I don't know the exact numbers of how that breaks down. That's a great question, though. Now I'm going to go find out.
Yeah, no worries. I think I'll look into it too. And if I could just sort of, while I have the floor, I have one more question. And it's about preservation standards for NHLs. I wonder if I don't know if you have worked with the preservation side of them, but whether those, you know, the Secretary's standards still apply. But I wonder if they're sort of more rigorous in the way that the criteria are, if you have a sense of what that looks like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it is more rigorous. And one of the reasons that it's more rigorous is that your documentation is more detailed. And so what is contributing and what is not contributing is very sort of deeply explored. And so when you get into projects, it's a lot of, you know, what was a contributor, what was not a contributor. I mean, and it can come down to, like, at Pond Farm Pottery, the wheels the pottery wheels are part of the designation. And so if you're doing a project on that building, you have to make sure that it's not going to disturb the wheels or, some of those things. So, I mean, even if you think about that Frank Lloyd Wright house, that will also, it will be a higher level of scrutiny using the Secretary of the Interior standards for that. Good question.
I mean, in that case, I wonder, like, who is the authority for these privately owned, like, who's reviewing the plans for preservation if it's not a Park Service owned site?
That's a really good question.
If it's a Park Service owned site, then they'll be dealing with that, probably through Section 106, and dealing with it through the SHPO's office as well, sort of interfacing with that. But it depends on where it is, what state it's in, and what their preservation program is. If it's in a certified local government, it'll work differently. So it just kind of depends on what the level of oversight is, depending on the preservation program and the jurisdiction.
Thank you.
But if it's privately owned, is there a trigger for design review for NHLs?
Depending, it depends on.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, it depends. I've worked in a couple of different certified local governments, and in some of them, they continue to do design review for NRs and NHLs. In another one that I was in, they do no review for NRs and NHLs because they say that's outside their purview. So it's a very interesting, I've worked in different parts of the country, so it's a very interesting way to think about it. But the person who is doing the project should be reviewing the fact that, this is an NHL and there's interior standards and things of that nature. But yeah, the level of oversight really depends depending on where you are.
Janet and then Ellen, if you have a question. Let's go in that order. Oh, Janet, you're muted.
Thanks. I just want to piggyback on the question about the responses from National Park Service, because, if you're sending this letter of inquiry and you're getting this, sounds like a pretty detailed response. Who exactly does that in the NPS? Is it a regional office? Because this is such a broad range of subjects.
It's a regional office.
Interesting. So they have to go do the deep dive themselves.
They do. And it's very interesting to work with them because they have this fantastic knowledge of, it seems an inexhaustible amount of topics, but they do the research, they check out what you're telling them, they see what they think. So they're really doing a lot of due diligence. There is NHL staff in the regional office. In San Francisco, I think there's two main people doing the review, and so they do a really great job of here's what we think of this, and we would take this out, or we're not convinced by this, and then we think this is a really great resource and things like that. And so it's been really nice to work with them. But yeah, it has to be regional. But the regional offices are also covering large spans. The San Francisco office covers, I think, the West and also Guam and Hawaii. And so it's, there's a lot of different elements there. So they're kind of juggling a lot of places at once. But they do have a pretty encyclopedic knowledge of some of these things. And also stay up on the newest literature as well. So my students were sometimes directed to very new articles and things to look at, and also older dissertations. And I don't know where they were finding things, but they were doing a great job.
Ellen, did you have a question?
Hi. Yes, yeah, I do. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you. That was really a great presentation. I work in the arena of, well, I like to say it, applied archaeology, cultural resources management, do a lot of 106, Section 106 documentation and evaluations. But I'm interested in how we, our evolution over the last 50, 100 years, and these very rigid classifications, we those of us who are in preservation like to be broadening and getting more sites included in our preservation conservation arena. So what I'm interested in, and the fellow, I think the other fellow mentioned landscapes, and you were going to look into that, Annie, maybe on, gee, how much landscape is being a factor into not only these specific buildings and structures, but can we get some landscapes identified as a national? And we have wetlands of significance, and I work a lot in that arena too. But that's one idea. One thing I'd like any further comments on. But then the other thing is I took great attention to your note that there are no African American national historic landmarks, and how I guess those of us that might be interested in that arena, we would need to be very creative about being on the lookout for trying to do something in that. We have some more comments on it.
Yes, absolutely. So I'll start with the landscapes. There are definitely National Historic Landmarks that are landscapes, and landscapes are encouraged, and it's no different than a structure. So that's definitely something that you could write an inquiry letter for and move forward. And something like a wetlands would be great. You just have to decide, where does it fit? What is it telling us, right? So what is that moment? What is that story it tells related to American history? So that's really the challenge, is trying to figure out what is the story this site tells, and how does it really fill in our gaps or teach us something important. And then as far as African American sites, there are no African American National Historic Landmarks in California. There are National Register sites in California, and I have heard that there is some movement to do some designated in Oakland through Congress, but I don't have any details on that.
Okay.
But yeah, right. The Sunset Garden, go for it. So that'd be a great idea.
Yeah.
And so that's I was shocked when I found that out. And my students spent some time surveying the state. They have very extensive spreadsheets when we were working on it, of sites all over the state. I emailed CLG managers and said, who are the history keepers in your area? Who knows these things? So we've got these really great ideas of places that might work. So we turned all our work over to National Park Service, and we'll see what they do. But it's been a very interesting process to look at some of these sites. I think I'm not actually allowed to tell you which ones we forwarded, but I'm hoping that they'll result in some National Historic Landmarks in the future, potentially.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's good.
Mm-hmm. I do wonder about the integrity question when it comes to landscapes. It does sound like there's some flexibility depending on the type of property in the integrity analysis. And I think that would have to extend to landscapes, assuming it was nominated under the design criteria. Mm-hmm. They're not as, they change more frequently than buildings.
The conversation that I've usually had about landscape is there's an interest in what the original design of the landscape was, what planting was there originally, and then for those elements that are still there, are these the original trees? Are these the original, agave plants or whatever they are? And, can we tell that from the amount of growth that we've seen from the historic photos, right? So one of the ones that they like to show us a lot for landscape example is the John Muir House, which they have a historic photo where the palm trees in front of the house are really small. But if you look at it today, the palm trees are like super, super tall, right? So that's a great way to look at, like, okay, historically, there's got to be the same palm trees because this is historic growth. So it's fine to have growth. It's fine for things to be overgrown. But we had to document things like, the orchard isn't there anymore at Pond Farm. The terraced landscape is still there, and it was planned as a terraced landscape, but the garden is not still there. The greenhouse is still there, but the plants aren't. So, there was a whole conversation, but you also, looking at circulation. Does the landscape still work the same way? What is the access and egress the same? So it's a very interesting process. But they do have people at NPS to help you with kind of thinking about how that gets argued and constructed.
Was there ever a question at Pond Farm that maybe the site did not retain integrity due to the loss of, some of the farm, the orchard and some of the land uses there?
Not really. Okay. The one, the boundaries are really important for a National Register, right? They're very important for a National Historic Landmark too, and I probably should have talked about that. They don't have to be the same as the National Register. Sometimes they're going to be smaller, actually, just like the period of significance will be a little tighter. And at Pond Farm, some of the things that were missing were not part of the boundaries. So, for example, the boundaries of the And so
Got it.
we'll look at the views and talk about whether or not the view sheds are consistent. But if the the terracing is still there are plenty of things that we could say this is still there, or the century plants that she wrote about a lot, there's still some evidence of those. And so there's things that we could talk about that were fine. And then we just documented the things that weren't there. A lot of people talked about the orchard, the peach orchard. That's not there anymore. And some of the other trees that were important, they're not there anymore. We're doing the same thing at Sutter's Fort. That was a very carefully designed landscape that changed over time. We've documented what we have about the Sutter's Fort landscape, but it's definitely changed. Some of that has been based on, the city widens the streets or decides that those trees aren't viable anymore and they don't want to maintain them, not realizing that those were like put in by Daughters of the Native West's chapters from all over the state, who donated a tree that was based on their county, but most of those are gone. So to be able to talk about what is still there, and like the ponds and there's monuments within the ponds that were put there at that time, so we document what's still there and hope that it meets criteria. And I think integrity is, they're willing to be a little flexible on integrity, I think, for landscape, because it's so hard to, you can't keep, it's very hard to keep things exactly the way that they were. Things grow, people make decisions, right? So that would definitely be a thing that you would have to talk to in your inquiry letter, maybe pose those questions, because you can pose direct questions in the letter if you want to.
Great, thank you so much. So yeah, I see Chris here, and then after Chris, if anybody else has a final question, we can wrap up after that. Go ahead.
I'm curious a little bit how you came to focus on Pond Farm, and specifically whether or not the house documentation, did it in any way lead to the decision to apply for National Historic Landmark?
So Pond Farm Pottery, the decision to do that one was pretty interesting, because previously all of my work with the National Historic Landmark Program had been at my previous institution in Orlando. And I've been working with the Washington office, and they chose our sites because we never get to choose them ourselves, at least within that program that I was in. And when I got to California, I contacted the regional office and said, hey, I still want to do this. And they were like, well, we have to think about what we have. And it's not just about picking a site that needs to be designated. It's also like, what can reasonably be done in 15 weeks? What can reasonably be done by graduate students? How big is the class? Is there enough work? Is there too much work? And so the decision to do Pond Farm was, in part, it was a site that they knew needed designation. It's been threatened by fire many times. It's very dry up there. It's owned by state parks. They wouldn't usually do a site that was owned by a government agency. They would say you can pay for your own National Historic Landmark, but there wasn't one that fit the other criteria well enough. And they wanted to start out with us and see how I worked, because I was new. So we got Pond Farm Pottery because it seemed to check most of the boxes. And so, poor graduate students, it was like their second week, and I'm like, we're going to Guerneville, and up we went. And they got up really early in the morning and drove up there, and we did a lot of documentation, but it was a lot of pre-work on my part as well, to talk to the stewards of the coast and redwoods, to talk to the Park Service. We wanted to see the butterfly cottages, which are owned by another person, so I had to negotiate with that owner so that we could get on property. And so all of that happened before we ever arrived. And then so these are like first semester graduate students in their first month who were like, oh my goodness, what are we doing? And they're hiking the site, and I was really proud of them for doing that. But it has not thus far been my choice. It's been someone else's choice. Sutter's Fort was also not my choice, but that was, I enjoy the project very much, but it was selected during COVID. And we were located in Sacramento, and so we had a lot of relationships with the local repositories, and it made it more possible to do, because it would have been hard to travel, and most of it would have been virtual, and a lot of digitized collections. And they do look at the collections that are available, and putting that in your inquiry letter is also important to talk about what the repositories are that you anticipate using, because they'll be looking for that too. We use all the documentation that there is. So if there's a HALS, we've got it. If there's a National Register, we have it. Janet's National Register was very important to us during Pond Farm Pottery. So any documentation that's been done. Sutter's Fort, we have a pile of archaeological reports and reports that have been done by state parks over time, of alterations that have been done. any kind of landscape survey or anything like that. We gather all the things and just sort of put it all together. But the landscape reports are very, very helpful, particularly when you have students who do not know plants and so cannot tell you what their actual names are, other than, you know, tree type 1, tree type 2. These are two. This seems to be a pine tree. I've read things that say this seems to be a pine tree. I'm like, that's not enough. But, you know, that's part of teaching. But yeah, so those are very, very helpful. So we take advantage of all the resources for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, great answer. Are there any final questions? It's 7:04, so we're a little bit over schedule. But I want to give everybody the chance. Okay, I'm not seeing any raised hands or cameras on, so I think let's call it an evening. Thank you so much, Anne. I think that was so insightful. I recently wrapped up a National Register nomination, and my clients have been very curious whether or not they're eligible for NHL. And I think I'll just forward them this presentation because I didn't know. I was just like, maybe, I just don't know. So thank you for helping clarify a lot of questions that I have, and others apparently.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Great.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.
It was fun.
This will be up on YouTube in a few days.
Yeah.
All right.
Keep in touch,
Thanks so
Anne.
much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.